So since it's the Feast of Transfiguration, and we've read Matthew's account of it, and as Lawrence pointed out, there's an account in the three synoptics and possibly even in John. I had a look at the Lucan version of it. And it's interesting to see that there are a few little different words, some of which are very, very exotic. So there's one word in this version where Luke uses the word exodus, that Jesus is going to orchestrate an exodus from Jerusalem. So just pay attention to this reading from Luke's version. We stand for the gospel. Jesus took Peter, John, and James and went up the mountain to pray. While he was praying, his face changed in appearance, and his clothing became dazzling white. And behold, two men were conversing with him, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his exodus that he was going to accomplish in Jerusalem. Peter and his companions had been overcome by sleep, but becoming fully awake, they saw his glory and the two men standing with him. As they were about to part from him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." But he did not know what he was saying. While he was still speaking, a cloud came and cast a shadow over them, and they became frightened when they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my chosen son. Listen to him." After the voice had spoken, Jesus was found to be alone. They fell silent and did not at that time tell anybody what they had seen. Words inspired by God. When somebody has a reputation for not being very punctual, we sometimes use the phrase that he's going to be late for his own funeral. He's going to be late for his own funeral. Well, I don't know whether or not I'm going to be late for mine, but I know that I was late for 2 of the most important funerals in my life. Not just late, really late. In fact, I was so late that I missed both of them. One of them happened in 1965, and the other happened in 1975. And I'll give you the backstory to it. From age 6 until age 18, when I entered the seminary, I was practically raised by my maternal grandmother, whom I called Nana. She lived with us, but both of my parents worked full-time, so all the childcare of five kids was left to my maternal grandmother, whom I called Nana. So she was, maybe the second most important woman in my life. And then I got to the seminary at age 18 in September of 1964. And the first year particularly is really, really strict. There was no contact allowed with family of origin. So one day on the 13th of April in 1965, I got called into the rector's office. And he was a strange little guy called Jimmy Lane. He never looked up, and he had this strange voice. He said, "Your grandmother is dead." I'm just shocked. And I didn't know which it was, so I said, "Which grandmother, Father?" Your mother's dead." And dead silence. And I said to him, "What happened?" "She got pneumonia about 4 days ago, and they brought her into hospital, and she died today." I'm sitting there in shock, and I say, "When is the funeral?" He says, the funeral's in 4 days' time." And I said to him, "How am I going to get there? I'm like 150 miles away, I don't have a car or any transport." He said, "Let the dead bury the dead." And that was the end of it. And so 6 weeks later, the academic year ended, and I go home, and I've missed my grandmother's funeral by 6 weeks. Fast forward 10 years, and now I'm in Kenya. I've been ordained in 1972, in June 72. I go to East Africa, and it was typically a 3-year tour. You stay there for 3 years, you come home for 3 months vacation. And I lived in very remote areas. I didn't have telephone services, and the postal service was terrible, so a letter from Ireland might take 2-3 weeks to get there. And so I'm going home. I plan to go home in the middle of August in 1975, because I knew my brother was due to get married, my youngest brother, at the end of August. So I arrive home in Ireland about the 15th of August 1975 to find that my other grandmother had died and been buried 2 weeks previously. Now, this is the woman who raised me from the time I was born until I was 6 years of age. because I lived with her. I didn't live with my parents for the first 6 years, and she was arguably the most important woman in my life. And now I've missed her funeral by 2 weeks. She died on the 6th of August in 1975. So today is actually her 42nd anniversary. And she died on the Feast of the Transfiguration, August 6th. So that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about Transfiguration. And I'm just going to make 3 main points this morning. I'm going to talk about the Transfiguration of 33 AD. And then secondly, I want to talk about the Transfiguration of 1945. And then thirdly, I want to talk about the Transfiguration of 2017. So firstly, the Transfiguration of 33 AD. The story, as you've heard in 2 sources now, is that very shortly before he died, probably 10, maybe 2 weeks before he died, Jesus takes Peter and James and John up on top of a mountain, probably Mount Tabor. Now, Matthew says a high mountain. In actual fact, it's only 1,886 feet high. But if you live in the land of Israel, that's a high mountain. And he takes these 3 with him, and suddenly he's transfigured, so much so that he's radiating light. His clothes even are picking up in it. And all of a sudden, they see Moses and Elijah. Now, how they recognize these 2 guys, I have no idea. Because in Jewish law, it was totally forbidden to have a graven image of anybody. Photography hadn't been invented. They weren't allowed to do any artwork. So how they recognized was Moses and Elijah, it beats me. But it's a little bit like when you dream at night, sometimes you say, I had this weird dream last night. I was in my home. It didn't look anything like my home, but I knew it was my home. So somehow, in this visionary state, they knew somehow it was Moses and Elijah, and they're talking with Jesus. Now, if you believe in the reality of Moses, he died about the year 1210 BC, and Elijah died about 800 BC. But there's a reason that they're being put there, because in the Jewish system, the Jewish scriptures are divided into 3 parts. There's an acronym called Tanakh, T-N-K. T stands for Torah. These are the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, which are ascribed to Moses, and they're the books of the law. They're the books that contain all 613 precepts of Judaism. Now, the next section is called Nebi'im, from the Hebrew word Nebi, which means a prophet. And these have to do with all the great characters in Jewish lore, like Elijah. And then there's a third section called Kitsubim, which means the writings. And this came much, much later. This had to do with the existential issues that Judaism was wrestling with as a result of the Babylonian captivity and exposure to Zoroastrianism. So the book of Ruth and the book of Job, they come from this period, trying to figure out the problem of evil, all these kinds of stuff. Now, at the time of Jesus, the Pharisees believed in the Torah, they believed in the prophets, and they believed in the Ketubim, in the writings. The Sadducees did not. The Sadducees only believed in Moses, in other words, the law, and the prophets. They did not believe in the Ketubim. They did not believe in the other writings. They didn't believe they were scriptural. And so very, very often, to talk about the Hebrew scriptures, they just mentioned the law and the prophets. And so now, here is Jesus having an encounter with the originator of the law and the first of the great prophets. So in kind of Catholic orthodoxy, it's meant to represent the fact that 2 or 3 weeks before he dies, Jesus is bringing to completion the Hebrew scriptures by an encounter with the law and the prophets, with Moses and Elijah. Now, I want to offer a slightly different take on that today. Because when you look at the literature, Jesus is not just a new Moses or a new Elijah. The character of Moses, if he ever existed, and there's absolutely no historical evidence that he did, but if he did, he was one of the most violent men in human history, answering to and obeying one of the most violent gods in human history. Moses had to leave Egypt as a young man because he'd murdered an Egyptian. He went away and he married a woman called Zipporah, and then he met God at the burning bush and was told to go back in and set the people free. He orchestrated under this God figure the murder of all the firstborn in Egypt, man and beast alike. And then when you read through the book of Exodus, and particularly the book of Numbers, he slaughtered literally millions of human beings under what was called the ban. And this was the injunction that when they captured a city, they had to kill every man, every woman, every child. In fact, the phrase that's used in the scriptures is, kill everything that breathes. In other words, all mammalian life gets wiped out. Now, so Moses, this character, if he ever existed, is offering a series of commandments based on law and discipline and fear of Yahweh. Christ is meeting him with a different kind of a law. In Christ's system, there's only one law. It is the law of love. love even of the enemy. Elijah is another character who was an extraordinarily violent man. He was a prophet in Israel about 800 BC. The king of Israel at the time was a guy called Ahab. And Ahab had married a Philistine princess called Jezebel, one of the toughest ladies in all the scripture. And Jezebel had brought her own wisdom tradition with her into Israel. She was a devotee of a god called Baal. And she brought in 450 of her own priests, prophets. And Elijah was incensed at this. Now, the word Elijah actually was a nickname that he gave to himself. Elijah in Hebrew, Eliyahu, literally means Yahweh is my God. Now, neither Moses nor Elijah were monotheists. Even if you believe Moses existed, he was not a monotheist. His first commandment is, first, I am the Lord, your God. You're not allowed to have these other gods in front of me. And he did battle with the gods of Egypt. So Moses was not a monotheist. Neither was Elijah. But Elijah believed that the Israelites had made a covenant with a particular God called Yahweh. And he said, I'm sticking to that. And now you're following this other God that this princess has brought in. So there's a competition held on Mount Carmel between Elijah's God and the gods of Baal. And of course, history is written by the winners. Elijah wins. And the response is, grab them. And they grab the 450 prophets of Baal, and they take them down to the brook Jabbok, and they slit their throats. 450 beheadings. And when Jezebel finds out it, she says, may my God do such and such to me if by this time tomorrow I don't have your head. And so Elijah flees. And so the second case in all the scriptures that we hear of an alien abduction. Elijah is taken up into heaven in a fiery chariot. So he's abducted by this God because, otherwise Jezebel was going to get him. So Jesus is meeting Elijah up there, I don't think just as representative of the prophets. Elijah was the personification of intolerance of other wisdom traditions and vicious, violent, warfare. And Christ is saying there's a different way. Christ is so open that when he sent out his apostles, he said, preach to all nations. There's no exclusion, there's no good guys, and there's not bad guys. So rather than believe that somehow Christ is bringing to fulfillment what Moses and Elijah represented, I think he's making a totally different statement in this transfiguration. He's saying there is only one law, and it is the law of love, even for the enemy. There's only one kind of prophecy, and it's a prophecy that calls us into the acceptance and the realization of the wisdom traditions of all God's children. So that's the first thing that comes to me when I think about the notion of transfiguration in Jesus. The second thing that strikes me about his transfiguration is that it feels to me, as I read the accounts, particularly in the synoptics, that this was actually the dress rehearsal for the resurrection. He's going to be dead within 2 or 3 weeks. This is the dress rehearsal where he's literally showing what happens when the soul shines through the human body, when there's a release of the astral body or the soul body, whatever you want to call it, that is so powerful that it radiates not just through his visage and his face, but even through his garments. They pick up on this. And when you fast forward a fortnight and he's now dead and he's risen from the dead, there's this famous story about the Shroud of Turin. I don't know how au fait you are with that. It's an ancient linen piece. We know scientifically it goes back at least to the 1300s. The belief is that it's actually the burial shroud of Jesus Christ. And certainly it's about a 14-foot linen strip that was wrapped over a body of a man who was crucified through the wrists. You can see the marks of the wrists, whose back is totally covered with scourging, and who wore some kind, not a crown of thorns, but a cap of thorns. And there's the blood and the imprint. So how did that thing get imprinted? It almost feels to me like it was like a spontaneous radioactive burst where the soul bursts through the physical container and imprints an image on a piece of linen. Now, is that ridiculous belief system? When you think about it, every one of you sitting here today did exactly the same thing, except that you imprinted your astral body in this physical thing you're sitting in right now. You picked up carbon and hydrogen and oxygen and nitrogen from planet Earth, and you fashioned the spacesuit in which you sit in this church this morning. So why would it be unthinkable that the same astral body could project its image onto a strip of linen? There are cases in human history, even very modern cases, of what's called spontaneous combustion, where the human body bursts into flames and gets burned up, literally gets burned up. And there's no medical reason why it should happen. It's called spontaneous combustion. Now, the reality is that the typical human body contains about 100 trillion cells. And every cell is composed of about 100 trillion photons. So there are literally about 10 to the power of 28 photons in a human body. If we knew how to do it, we don't know how to do it yet, but it's scientifically feasible that if you could release all of the light, all of the photons in a single human body, you could light up a baseball stadium at 1 million watts for 3.5 hours. That's how much light is in the human body. There's a whole tradition in Tibet called the rainbow body. The belief system, and allegedly a lot of anecdotal evidence suggesting that some of these great, great teachers, these great avatars in the Buddhist tradition, when it comes time to shuffle off this mortal coil, they literally do that. They sit down in meditation and they dissolve into what's called a rainbow body. It resolves into pure energy. Some accounts say there's nothing left except the clothes. Now, some say actually sometimes there's hair left and there are teeth left, but everything else is gone. It's literally dissolved into light. And so what's the story about, is this what happens at the Transfiguration? That this was Jesus doing some kind of a dress rehearsal for the real thing, which would happen in 2 or 3 weeks' time. Now, when you look at Einstein's formula, E is equal to mc squared, and you rearrange the figures, and you say then that mass is equal to energy divided by the square of light, what you find out is that all mass in the universe is frozen light. Literally. All mass in the universe is frozen light. Now, so in some senses, everything, all matter comes from light. Now, you weigh that with sound. I believe that sound is the creative intelligence behind form making. So we find again and again and again, for instance, in John's Gospel, in the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh. So sound or vibration is that which orchestrates matter into particular life forms. The Aborigines in Australia believe that the entire universe was sung into being by the ancestors, that it was the sound of the music that actually called the mountains and the rivers and human beings into being. There was a great experiment done in a Belgian city some years back where they were celebrating their 1000th anniversary, where they did a whole series of experiments with music and sound. And one of them was they took a sheet of plate glass 8 feet long by 4 feet high by about 1 inch thick, and they clamped it in an upright position, and then they poured copious amounts of warm soapy water along the spine so that it flowed down both sides. And then they took musicians to play their instruments in front of it. And depending on the instrument and the pitch of the note, it created all of these wonderful forms on the soapy water. Because sound is extraordinarily creative. Now, when you put sound and light together, I believe that's how all life forms come into being. But they exist on spectra. So there's a spectrum of sound, all the way from really subtle sounds to kind of dense, hard rock kinds of sounds. There's subtle light, and there's dense kind of light. So as these two components dance together, all life beings come into being, I believe. So if you get a very subtle light dancing with very subtle sound, you get maybe angelic beings. If you get denser light dancing with denser sound, maybe you get rocks. If you talk about human beings, if you get subtle light dancing with subtle sound, you may get an avatar or a saint. If you get dense sound meeting dense light, you get a criminal or a psychopath. And so I think, when I think of Transfiguration of Jesus, that's what I'm thinking about, those scientific and spiritual possibilities. That's my first point. The second one then I want to talk about, the Transfiguration of 1945. All energy on planet Earth is sun energy. All energy on the planet is sun energy. And it comes through an extraordinary process. So the sun is basically a huge nuclear reactor based on fusion. The core of it is literally fusion. It's atomic fusion happening at the core, which is coming out in two energy forms, as light and as heat. But it's basically a nuclear reactor, a huge nuclear reactor. And it's spewing this energy and light and heat in all directions. There's a huge heliosphere that goes out even beyond Pluto. It's sending its energy out even beyond Pluto. And certainly Earth is right in the middle of it. So all energy on planet Earth comes from the sun. And the first creatures that could somehow harvest this were plants, flora, and they did it through a process of photosynthesis, where they could translate the energy of the sun into life for themselves. The second stage came with the herbivores, who began eating the plants. So now they got a second generation energy. They're taking energy from plants who took their energy from the sun. And then came the carnivores. The carnivores are eating the herbivores. And so now we're at third stage remove. We're taking energy from herbivores who took energy from plants who took energy from the sun. But all of it is energy from the sun. All energy on the planet is sun. All of our fossil fuels, whether it's turf in Ireland, or it's coal, or it's oil, it's all energy taken from the sun. Now, about 800,000 years ago, human beings, or whoever was present at the time, learned how to use fire. And we use it for several purposes. We use it to give ourselves light, to give ourselves heat, to give us protection against animals, and to cook our food. But inevitably, everything that human beings discover or invent, they will eventually weaponize. So we weaponized fire. We began to use fire as a way to burn down the villages of our enemies, or to destroy their food supplies, their granaries. So we've stepped it up over the millennia more and more, using this energy of the sun for weaponization. Every crusade, every inquisition, every war has utilized it. But probably the most horrific and most dramatic use of the sun's energy happened on the 6th of August in 1945, when the Enola Gay, a B-29 bomber loaded with the first atomic bomb, flew over Hiroshima. And they dropped it in a very specific way. They dropped it in such a fashion that it would explode several thousand feet above the ground. If it exploded on the ground, its effect would have been minimized. They wanted the radiation to spread as widely as possible. Now, if you were a citizen in Hiroshima that day, you saw precisely what the apostles saw on Mount Tabor. They saw a fantastic light and then a cloud, except this was a mushroom cloud. And I guarantee you they did not say, not a single one of them said what Peter said, Lord, it is good for us to be here. Not a single one of them said that. On that day and in the months following it, 146,000 human beings died. And the people who assembled that bomb and who deployed it had a pet name for it. Because of its size and its shape, they called it Little Boy. And this was the most destructive little boy in the history of planet Earth. It was composed of uranium-235, and uranium-235 has a half-life of 700 million years. 3 days later, we dropped a second bomb. It's a different shape completely. It was dropped in Nagasaki. And this one was based on plutonium-239, which was 10 times more effective than uranium-235. And they dropped it, and the nickname they had in this one was Fat Man, because of the shape of it. It's called Fat Man. And 80,000 people died in Nagasaki. Now, the difference between the two is this, that Hiroshima is in a plain, and so the radiation was able to spread without any interference. Nagasaki is in a valley, and so the mountains buffered the outlying area, so only 80,000 people died. But between the Feast of the Transfiguration in 1945 and 3 days later, the gift that the Christian West gave to the East was the death of almost 250,000 human beings. And since that time, we have detonated another 2,000 of these. God only knows what kind of damage is doing to our health and to Pachamama, planet Earth. So there was Transfiguration 1945, which brings me to Transfiguration 2017. All of the human energy involved in wielding a cudgel, or digging with a dagger, or throwing a spear, or shooting an arrow, is solar energy. All the chemical energy involved in gunpowder, TNT, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and atomic bombs is sun energy. All of the energy you employ when you kiss your baby, or hug your friend, or make love to your spouse is sun energy. But there's a totally different kind of coupling that happens. The first two types are sun energy coupled with a fear-based ego illusion that we're separate from God, we're separate from each other, and we're separate from nature. The last one is sun energy coupled with the love-based soul realization of unity consciousness. So at what stage, as human beings, are we going to stop becoming followers of a murderous Moses, if he existed, or a violent Elijah, if he ever existed? When are we going to stop being followers of Little Boy and Fat Man, and instead become followers of the Buddha of compassion, and the Christ of forgiveness of the enemies. Jesus' transfiguration, as far as I'm concerned, was the emblazoning of the soul's image on the fabric of incarnation. And every time you reach out with unconditional love to any other sentient being, it's like your soul, your own divinity, is bleeding through into your spacesuit. And so the question I would like to ask myself, leave with this morning, leave with you with, and leave myself with, is this. The Shroud of Turin, was it the linen in which Jesus' body was wrapped? When it comes my time to die, whether I'm going to be late for the funeral or not, and when it comes to your time to die, what impression do you want to make on your funeral shroud? And even when you're still alive, is there something you can do? Can you in some way tweak the way you think or the way you live in such a way that you're a living exemplar of transfiguration?